Psychology is defined as a discipline that seeks to improve the well-being of individuals. This can only be achieved by developing treatments and understanding how the brain works. In this chapter, we will look at how brain damage affects behavior, and even more importantly, and with a lot of hope, we would end this chapter with neuroplasticity, which is a sequel to what's been discussed throughout the entire term, but more specifically, chapter 9. Here are a few of the topics that will be discussed in this chapter. Please note that the first 3 modules are going to be focused on brain damage, and eventually we'll start covering neuroplasticity toward the last half of this chapter. In this module, we will be addressing the 6 causes of brain damage as described in your book. In this module, we'll be looking at 6 causes of brain damage. Please note that each of these has unique characteristics and effects on behavior and mental processes. When discussing brain tumors, it is important to note that there are different types of brain tumors and the differences that exist between them. Looking at the definition of neoplasm, please note that this is a tumor which is composed of a mass of cells that grows independently of the rest of the body. We know that of all tumors, about 20% of them are called meningiomas, and these are tumors that grow between the meninges. You may remember these are the 3 membranes that cover the central nervous system, the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. All meningiomas, which are these tumors, are encapsulated tumors, which basically mean that they're growing within their own membrane, sort of kind of like an engulfing of the mass. And these tend to be benign. Not always, but they usually are. And the good thing about this is that because they're all encapsulated, meaning like in a little capsule and engulfed, they're usually also surgically removable. Please note that depending on where the brain is developing this mass, or where the mass is allocated in the brain, the influence on behavior would be brought about by pressure that this would have on the surrounding tissue. For example, if you have a tumor in the occipital lobe, you may start having difficulty seeing. If you have a tumor in the temporal lobe, you may compromise your ability to hear, and so forth. Unfortunately, the encapsulation of the tumors that we discussed earlier is not a commonly seen thing. In fact, it is more of an exception rather than a rule when it comes down to brain tumors. Infiltrating tumors are other types of tumors that grow diffusely through surrounding tissue. Again, they're not encapsulated, so they're not easily removed. And unfortunately, this is the majority of the brain tumors, about 70% of them in comparison to 20, which we saw for meningiomas. These tumors, in addition to being the most popular, they're also usually malignant. That is to say that they are cancerous and they can be deadly. Because they're not encapsulated, these are difficult to remove or to destroy completely. And so one of the infiltrating tumors that exists is what we call gliomas. These are a type of infiltrating brain tumor that develops from the glial cells. You may remember glial cells come in various forms, and there are 4 types. Please note that these cells, one of the characteristics of gliomas, of tumors that are made up of glial cells, is that they have a very rapid growth. There is a percentage of brain tumors that did not originate in the brain. In fact, they grew from infiltrating cells that were carried to the brain via the bloodstream. And this is what we call the metastatic tumors. And metastatic tumors basically are brain tumors that originated elsewhere, and it's about 10% of the brain tumors that we see. Please note that metastasis refers to the transmission of disease from one organ to another. For some reason, the brain is a rather attractive place for some of these masses of tissue, and a lot of metastatic brain tumors originated as cancers of the lungs, and they gradually made their way through the bloodstream to the brain. Unfortunately, the chance of recovering from a cancer that has already attacked two or more separate sites is not very high. We will now turn over to cerebral vascular disorders. Please note that it is important for you to know the difference between the two types of stroke, cerebral hemorrhage and cerebral ischemia. Stroke is a sudden onset of cerebral vascular event that causes brain damage. Prior to 2015, stroke was the third leading cause of death in the United States and the most common cause of neurological dysfunction. Now, it is the fifth leading cause of death in the United States, and it continues to be the major cause of neurological dysfunction. Please note that it is also a leading cause of adult disability, as oftentimes the symptoms of a stroke just depend on where in the brain the stroke occurred, and this would bring about common consequences such as amnesia, aphasia, which is the inability to speak, paralysis of the entire body or just sides of the body, and also being in a coma. When these sudden cerebral vascular changes occur in the brain, they actually bring about an area or kill cells in the brain, and the area of the dead or dying tissue is what we call an infarct. The surrounding area around the infarct, this area of dead and dying tissue, is what we call the dysfunctional area called the penumbra. It is the primary goal of surgeons and doctors to preserve and save the penumbra, as it is the tissue that could be saved after a stroke, depending on several factors, one of them being the age of the individual. As stated earlier, the two major types of strokes are cerebral hemorrhage and cerebral ischemia. We'll be looking at cerebral hemorrhage in this slide here, and please note that this is basically when there is a bleeding that occurs in the brain. Cerebral hemorrhage occurs when a cerebral blood vessel, a little vein, pops or ruptures, and then the blood just basically infiltrates into the surrounding neural tissue, and because of its presence and different ions, it actually damages it. Bursting aneurysms are a common cause of intracerebral hemorrhage. An aneurysm is basically a development of a balloon-like part in the artery that forms in the wall, and at some point where the elasticity of the artery wall was defective, this made its way into that particular shape. Although a lot of aneurysms of the brain are usually problematic, aneurysms sometimes occur in other parts of the body. The aneurysms can be there since we were born, and they can also result from exposure to a lot of infections and poisons. This was actually demonstrated recently per studies in 2013. Although it is a good idea to not engage in cigarette smoking or alcohol consumption and be too stressed, this is particularly important for those that know they have aneurysms from birth. Cerebral ischemia is the other major type of stroke, but unlike the other one, which consists of bleeding, cerebral ischemia is a disruption of the blood supply to a specific area in the brain. The three main causes of cerebral ischemia are thrombosis, embolism, and arteriosclerosis. Looking at thrombosis here, please note that that is simply a plug, like mucus, if you will, and that's what's called a thrombus. When this is formed, this would block any blood from flowing into the site of its formation, and depending on where in the brain, it would bring about different effects and different symptoms. A thrombus may be composed of a fat or air bubble or blood clot, and sometimes there's even tumor cells. When the thrombus basically blocks in that specific area, it would inhibit any blood flow there. And we know that in blood we also have oxygen, so denying or depriving our neurons of oxygen can also result in the death of the cell. Embolism is also a plug, and this is what we call an embolus, and this is carried by the blood from a larger vessel where it was formed. So I think of it as actually being transported. And while it may be able to fit through some of these larger vessels, once it reaches a smaller one, that's where it becomes stuck, just because it doesn't fit. And basically what this is just a thrombus that has traveled through the larger vessels and now cannot navigate anymore. Arteriosclerosis is not a plug. This is actually a difficulty with the walls of the blood vessels. Because of fat consumption, fat deposit, we can actually cause this, and what it would do is it would actually narrow the vessels, whereas they may be able to allow a certain amount of blood for a period of time. Having too much fat in there, fat deposits, can narrow this to the point where it could bring about a complete blockage of the blood vessels. Shortly after the temporary cerebral ischemic episode, there is little evidence or no evidence of any type of brain damage. However, a substantial neuron loss can often be detected within a day or two after the cerebral ischemia. For reasons that aren't fully understood, we know that the ischemia-induced brain damage typically is more susceptible for neurons that are near the hippocampus area. The damage that is seen in the hippocampus area or wherever else it also damages is actually the consequence of a neurotransmitter. This is a neurotransmitter that actually serves a good purpose, and that is glutamate. However, the excess amount of glutamate brings about an overactivity of the receptors around it, especially NMDA receptors. This is basically a predominant molecular device that controls synaptic plasticity and memory function. So any type of impact on this in here would bring about a lot of influx of sodium and of calcium ions. Please note that calcium ions are involved in a lot of the signaling cascades and is thought about as an important mediator of learning and memory. And so because these are heavily populated in the hippocampal area, this is one of the reasons why we have evidence of this in here. Again, glutamate, the most prevalent excitatory neurotransmitter in our nervous system, is in part responsible for the damage that is seen after cerebral ischemia. By basically activating and overactivating the receptors, NMDA, this would bring about an influx of sodium and calcium, and the release of these in here would basically bring about more glutamate. This is a sequence of reactions that are occurring internally that will ultimately kill the neuron. It's important for individuals who suffer from cerebral ischemia to be administered a glutamate antagonist, and so that we could reduce the development of brain damage. By providing glutamate antagonists, basically what we'll reduce is a reduction of the excess of glutamate that would be brought about by the ischemia. By blocking the release of glutamate in excess, we could reduce the activity in the neurons, and it would allow the neurons to remain alive. In this slide, you can appreciate a recap of what was discussed earlier. And please keep in mind that with ischemia-induced brain damage, it does not develop the effects immediately. It takes about 1 to 2 days. It also does not impact all parts of the brain equally. More specifically, the hippocampus areas are what's affected most. And also the mechanism of damage will vary depending on the brain structure that's affected. Here you can see the first part where the blood vessel becomes blocked. This blockage basically brings about neurons that are affected by the release to secrete and release an excess amount of glutamate. This would basically bind to these NMDA receptors that I mentioned earlier, and this would trigger about a very active influx of sodium and potassium ions into the postsynaptic neurons. This excess amount that occurs in there eventually kills the neuron, but first triggers the excess amount release of glutamate from them, which would bring about spread damage all throughout. Because right before it kills the cell would actually activate to secrete higher levels of glutamate, and therefore again bringing about a toxic cascade of brain damage to the nearby area. Thankfully, brain tumors and cerebral vascular disease are not guaranteed in life. Neither are closed head injuries, but they are more prevalent, as it could happen while playing sports or while simply going to the grocery store to pick up something in a car accident. Please note that any blow to the head should be treated with extreme caution, especially when there is confusion and disturbances of our senses. This would be an indication of damage to the brain. Brain injuries due to blows do not necessarily need to penetrate the skull. Oftentimes we look at the skull, we say, oh, there's no blood, no foul, but we find that close-head injuries actually are a lot more complicated than that. Please note that our brain is a very spongy and very sensitive tissue. So any type of damage to it, it could bruise and bring about damage to the neurons that are affected by this in here. Contusions are a form of closed-head injuries, and these are injuries that involve damage to the cerebral circulatory system. This basically occurs when the brain would slam against the inside of the brain. You will see a video of concussion, but you will see a similar pattern through how the brain moves. This damage will bring about some hemorrhage, which again you already know is bleeding in the brain, and hematoma could develop, which is a bruise that would form in here. The hematoma is nothing more than a collection of clotted blood in an organ or a tissue. It is quite ironic to consider that while the skull's job is to protect the brain, it is in fact the skull and its hardness that brings about the injuries and contusions. It is not uncommon to find that contusions frequently occur on the side of the brain opposite to where the blow or where the impact happened. And the reason why is because of what we called contra-coup injuries. These are contusions, again, that impact the opposite side of the brain from where the blow occurred. And this, just think of physics. If you impact an individual on the left side, the brain would initially start moving in the direction of the blow, but eventually the brain would make its way over to the other side and slam violently against the skull. Contusions is not the same as a concussion. A concussion is typically diagnosed when there is no evidence that there was structural damage to the brain. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no disturbances or that it is a minimal thing. In fact, individuals who suffer from concussions also have disturbance of consciousness after a blow to the head. Although there is no apparent brain damage with a single concussion, we do know that repeated or multiple concussions can result in dementia, referred to as what we call the punch-drunk syndrome. This general intellectual deterioration and cerebral scarring are not unusual, and this has been observed in a controversial fashion in athletes and other individuals who repeatedly get exposed to concussions. And so this may remind you of a movie made by Will Smith called Concussion, in which this doctor argued in favor of protecting the players and the football players from continuous blows to the head. So football players, boxers, rugby players, or any other individual that has experienced repeated concussive or even subconcussive blows to the head is at major risk. Per a study in 2015, it was found that 34 of 35 former American football players met diagnostic criteria for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is basically what a lot of prominent and famous players from the NFL suffered from. One of the most perhaps notorious ones because of how tragic his death was Junior Seau, this lineman from the who played with the San Diego Chargers at the time. This guy suffered so many consequences and symptoms because of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, that he actually shot himself and died by shooting himself in the chest. He wanted to preserve the brain so that this could be studied a little bit more and they can understand what went wrong in his brain. Whenever microorganisms invade the brain, this can result in an infection. This would basically bring about an inflammation of the brain, and that's what we call encephalitis. Please note that the most common types of brain infections are those that are brought about by bacteria and those that are caused by viral infections. In the case of bacterial infections, please note that these often result in what is known as cerebral abscesses. These are pockets of pus that develop in the brain. The bacteria are also the major cause of meningitis, which is the inflammation of the meninges. And this is fatal in about 30% of adults. Antibiotics like penicillin and others sometimes are successful at eliminating the bacterial infections of the brain, but they sometimes cannot reverse any damage that may have already been made or produced by these infections. Syphilis is an example of bacterial infection that you may have heard about in the past. Syphilis is bacteria is passed down from individuals that would be infected, and this is done so with contact of the genital sores. The infected bacteria will eventually go into a dormant stage after several years, and it may seem like the individual had nothing. Initially, you may develop these sores, and then your body can also start getting a little bit more red, kind of like if you had chicken pox and you start getting a lot of red dots all over. But eventually it goes away, and it seems as though you're just going through stages. Your body's reacting to things, when in actuality it is syphilis that is attacking the body and eventually the brain. The other type of brain infection is what is known as viral infections. We know there are two types of viral infections of the nervous system. Those that have a particular affinity for neural tissue, meaning a preference, and those that attack the neural tissue, but they don't seem to have a preference for it more so than any other tissues. Rabies is one of the examples of viral infections, and this is transmitted through a bite of an animal that was infected with rabies. And this is very popular. It's been around for a while, and most individuals have heard of a case or have seen of this in here. The virus has this particular affinity for the nervous system, meaning it is drawn to it. It prefers to attack the neural tissues. As stated earlier, a lot of the tumors that travel from different parts of our body, they make their way over to the brain. This is something that's kind of similar. The virus seems to be drawn to the nervous system. Interestingly, the rage that is often brought about by the virus effect on the brain increases the likelihood that these animals will attack by biting. And so you see that with dogs, cats, raccoons, bats, mice, and different types of rodents. And this increases the spreading of the virus. Whenever rabies makes its way over to the brain, please note that most of the cases, individuals die because of rabies and the virus reaching the brain. One of the good things about rabies, if we could look on the bright side, is that it usually does not attack the brain. Now, there is a period of time of about 40 days in which the brain remains intact after the attack. This would allow and buy us some time so that we could take care of any shots and vaccines to prevent the infection of the brain. The other type of viral infection is the infection that does not prefer the neural tissue. Herpes would be an example of this type of viral infection. And although the viruses sometimes spread into the brain, they typically attack other tissues of the body as well. We know that viruses would play a greater role in neuropsychological disorders than is currently thought. We believe that the involvement of the cause of the disorders is often really difficult to understand because these infections often stay there in our bodies for years before sometimes they start producing any type of consequences or symptoms. So as a result of that, we sometimes miss the mark and we attribute it in the past to something other than a viral infection. I hope you can appreciate the blood-brain barrier a lot more after discussing some of these causes of brain damage. Unfortunately, the nervous system can also be damaged by exposing ourselves to a variety of chemicals, and these can often enter the brain through our GI tract, the gastrointestinal tract, through our food, and also from our lungs, and in some cases even through the skin. We know that heavy metals like mercury and lead, which are sometimes found in mercury and fish, and also lead in even some Mexican candy, as was the scandal a few years back, these can begin to accumulate in the brain, and these can damage the brain in a permanent fashion. This is what would produce what's known as a toxic psychosis, and that is a mental illness that is produced by a neurotoxin. Unfortunately, throughout history, we have made mistakes, and oftentimes they were not necessarily intended or with any ill will. In the 1950s, for example, some of the drugs that were administered to individuals who suffered from schizophrenia were basically affecting them. And so after several years of consuming these drugs, a lot of patients developed what is known as tardive dyskinesia, or TD, and that is a disorder that brings about motor deficits. Some of the primary symptoms that would be seen in these individuals was a constant involuntary smacking of the lips, sometimes also with sucking movements, and also a lot of movements with their jaws and their cheeks and their tongue, mostly in the facial area. And it is believed that it would have affected cranial nerves, and that's one of the reasons why they were having these involuntary processes. We also know that some of these neurotoxins are produced by our own body, and that is what is known as endogenous. So the example of this in here is that the body can produce these antibodies that would attack components of the nervous system. Think back to the example of glutamate and how this amazing neurotransmitter, when secreted in excess, can also bring about damage. Some neurotoxins that are endogenous, that are produced by our body, can also bring about damage to the brain. We also have genetic factors to take into account for any neuropsychological diseases. Now, when we look at genetic origins, please note that this is not related to a dominant gene being influential in this. The majority of these occur in a chromosomal error that would then result in, an example, Down syndrome, which is when during ovulation a mother would end up with an extra 21st chromosome, and it would be in the egg. And so as a result of that, the egg is fertilized, and instead of having 2 chromosomes 21, we'd have 3. The zygote would then develop with particular characteristics that would be seen physically as well as psychologically. Part of the reason why genetic factors are not related to dominant genes is also because the individuals who carry a gene that would be in some way disadvantageous would often have difficulties surviving and reproducing. Whereas in contrast, individuals who inherit one abnormal recessive gene and do not develop the disorder, then the gene would be passed on to future generations. Please note that genetic factors can also be affected by age. An example of Down syndrome, we find that 0.15% of births, probability increases with the mother's age. And we find that there is a prevalence of 1 out of 1,167 births when the mother is 20, whereas when the mother is 49 when she got pregnant, there's a 1 in 11 chances of giving birth to a child with Down syndrome. So you can see again here that genetic factors are not only based on carrying a gene, but also on age and other factors outside of the genotype. In Chapter 9, you learned about apoptosis, which is the cell's genetic program for destroying themselves, basically committing suicide. And while this seems to play a role in the development of our nervous system, it also plays a role in brain damage. In fact, all the 6 causes of brain damage that we've discussed, tumors, cerebral vascular disorders, close-hit injuries, infections, toxins, and genetic factors, they all produce neural damage in part by activating apoptosis, and that is a self-destruction. We used to believe that the death of the neurons that would happen because of brain damage was a necrotic process. And necrotic basically meaning that it was passive cell death that would result from the injury. But now recent evidence demonstrates that if the cells are not damaged very severely, then oftentimes these cells attempt to basically gather enough resources to complete a suicide. This would be a little bit more on the active type of suicide and death. However, the cell death is not either considered an either-or situation. Some of the dying cells that we see in there would display signs of both necrosis and apoptosis.